Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down my third place match from Clash for the Cash against Henry Reynolds. Now, Henry is a fencer that I have fought before, and it is someone who gave me actually quite a lot of trouble in previous Philly tournaments like Revolution Rumble. Now, one of the things about the previous tournaments in which I've fought Henry is that they've all had right-of-way rule sets, at least as far as I can remember. I think I might have fenced him also at AGO, but I think it was during a team match, so I don't exactly count it. And the point here is that Henry had a very, very well adapted style to a right-of-way rule set that allowed him to beat me. And this time around, I was really excited to fence him again because one, I would get to finally see what he fences like potentially normally, or maybe in an adaptive style where he maybe has made some changes just for me or made some changes just for the rule set. And at the exact same time, I get to show off whether or not I have been able to adapt to Henry. So we had a really interesting fight. And one thing right on the offset that I want to point out is that, at least from what I could perceive, one of the big changes that Henry made to his style, again, whether or not it was just for me or just for this tournament, it looked like he got a lot more measured and a lot more tempered in his aggression. Gone were the kinds of attacks that I saw at Revolution Rumble, where Henry would full send a big deep lunge with a hand hit. And again, in that tournament, that made a lot of sense. And while it might not make as much sense here in this tournament, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a staple of someone's style and something that they can necessarily change. So big props to Henry right off the bat for being able to change his style so drastically for a completely different fighter and or a completely different tournament, because as you'll probably see while we go through this footage, I'm not really capable of doing that at all. So starting off with our first exchange, which is often the longest exchange, we get to talk about things like footwork and distance and the overall temperament of each fighter. And in this particular fight, Henry is being very passive. He's being a little defensive. Normally, I'm used to him coming fresh out of the gate and just kind of charging me down. And in this case, I finally get the chance to really take stock of how he fences and get a good look at his footwork and his distance work, only to realize that somehow I hadn't realized up till now that Henry is left-handed. And what's very interesting about the fact that Henry being left-handed is that he still fights with his non-dominant leg forward, which means he fences in the exact same style as I do, just with a different dominant hand. Now, one thing I've talked about before is that when you are right-handed and you fence with your left leg forward, one of the features of this kind of style is that every time you make a commitment, you can make it with a passing step with your dominant leg, meaning that you are going to push off with your dominant leg, take a big passing step forward, and land with your dominant leg forward. This has its own set of pros and cons, but when you're left-handed and you're fencing with your non-dominant leg forward, you get a different set of pros and cons, despite the fact that you're technically doing the same thing. The reason, of course, is that when you are left-handed and your opponent is right-handed, you are always going to exist kind of on the outside line of their guard, meaning that when I'm right-handed and I'm sitting right here in the middle, especially because my left leg is forward and I'm very square, Henry, when he takes a step forward, is going to be on the outside of my line, really on this side. And the issue with that is that when you're left-handed and you throw your complete dominant side strikes, you're going to be targeting the lead arm, lead shoulder, and just that side of my head with most of your attacks. Parrying that outside line is somewhat easy when you're used to it, but when you're not used to it and you're used to fighting right-handed people, you're constantly thinking about shifting from a dominant side guard to a non-dominant side because that's where most of the attacks of your opponent are coming from. Meaning that you have to be very, very careful about how you throw your defensive parries because sometimes your instincts might tell you to throw them in the wrong direction. Now, for this particular exchange, we get what is essentially a classic that is going to happen frequently throughout the tournament. I am dancing in and out of range. I am waiting for Henry to commit, and when he does, I very briefly tap his blade out of measure with what you could say is a crump, but really is more of like a beat attack, and then I throw a right Zverkow. And the reason a right Zverkow is the correct choice in this instance is because Henry is left-handed. All of his dominant side things are going to come from my dominant side, which means that I get to take full advantage of the fact that a right Zverkow, which normally has your hands forward and not crossed, gives me a lot of range, it gives me a lot of options, it gives me areas that I can shoot for, and most importantly, My longer guard with my hand forward is going to run right up against Henry's longer guard with his dominant hand forward. And when we clash with our hands, it's very frequently going to result in a situation where we maybe don't land our initial attack so great, or my Zverka manages to get in underneath, and I have a nice little shelf to protect my head. For our second exchange, we have a little bit of a messy double one, but one that clearly demonstrates what I was talking about before about the left hand versus right hand open Zverkaus. So what happens in this exchange is I decide I'm going to get a little bit cheeky, get a little bit aggressive, and just do a nice big flying right Zverkau towards my opponent's head. And to Henry's credit, he immediately recognizes that I'm coming forward with some kind of attack and immediately snipes me in the hand as I'm coming forward. So while I'm jumping through the air like an idiot, I get my hand taken off, and then I decide to finish my right Zverkau, which, of course, is out of tempo. But what's important to notice here is that as I'm throwing my leaping right Zverkau, my right hand and Henry's left hand collide in the air. And this is important to know because one of the things about right-handed versus left-handed fencing is that oftentimes these lead hands are going to clash far more frequently than in a right-handed versus right-handed fight. And the reason you need to be aware of that is if you are a grapple-heavy kind of fencer, knowing this means that you can often get into situations where that hand clash results in both of the entry cuts being ruined. Now, in this particular case, Henry, who threw the left Zverkau, probably would have had a serious advantage in being able to not only hit me, given that I was jumping through the air at the time, but also in his ability to cover if it were not for the fact that I got such a steep offline motion with my jumping Zverkau that I was still able to kind of land to the head. Now, again, in this particular rule set and in most understandings of tempo, I'm out of time and whether or not I land doesn't actually matter. But what does matter is the fact that if we would say that Henry didn't actually manage to make it to my hand in the first intention and instead was focusing on trying to box me out, there is a understanding here that this clash of hands might have been better utilized by Henry to completely stuff my right hand into my face, thus ruining my ability to actually throw my opening attack. So if instead of simply trying to snipe me in the hand, Henry went deeper and went towards my head, there was actually a pretty decent chance he would have not only hit my head in the opening salvo, but also would have been able to stuff my Zverkau so effectively that I wouldn't have been able to throw anything in return, on top of the fact that I probably would have still been out of tempo. So I skipped an exchange in which I don't know how to protect my hands, but this exchange is another very interesting one. And what's interesting about this is that Henry is trying to snipe my hands, and he's doing so in a very unique fashion. Normally, when someone tries to snipe your hands, what they're effectively doing is they're inching closer and closer and throwing out probing strikes, because what they want to do is they want you to either overcommit to a parry that isn't actually coming out, or they want you to just kind of change guards into one in which you're cross guard is not setting atop your hands. The idea being that if you manage to interrupt somebody when they're moving their hands around, chances are whatever you throw at their hands is going to hit their hands. And this is the principle behind what Henry is basically doing, but he does it in two parts. He throws a little bit of taps to my blade, throws a hand cut that doesn't quite make it to my hands, but he notices that my response to something being thrown at my hands is to pull my hands back. And again, this isn't necessarily a very bad idea. However, what happens whenever you pull something back is that your natural human instinct is to then return it to where it was. And Henry has a game plan for capitalizing on that exact human condition thing. The idea here is that Henry throws a little bit of a baited hand strike that wasn't very well committed and probably wasn't going to land no matter what. But as I pull my hands back and start to return them, he throws a follow-up thrust to my hands. And this is actually a really ingenious move, because the idea here is that normally when you're thrusting at someone's hands, it's really, really hard to land. The reason it's hard to land is because any amount of backwards momentum that your opponent might have in their hands or in their body is going to take away from your thrust. Stabbing someone in something like the chest is a whole lot easier because that part of their body can't move around very fast, but their hands can move very quickly. So by taking advantage of the fact that Henry knows that my hands are going to be moving forward, he's taking advantage of the head-on collision style physics scenario where he knows that any amount of contact he's going to make with his hand thrust is going to make a big clack, it's going to maybe stick, it's going to maybe bend his sword in a way that it never would if he stabbed me in the hands while my hands were moving backwards. However, the judges don't really see this hand shot, and chances are I don't really feel it either. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of having really good gear and really thick gloves is that sometimes you don't feel these kinds of things. But I believe that part of the reason that Henry does manage to land this hand thrust is because of this really smart timing thing. However, again, the judges don't see it. And my follow-up is one where I basically capitalize on the fact that Henry has hesitated for a moment, thinking that he got a point, and use it to throw a feint, which I bait a very, very large over parry out of Henry, delay my attack for just a second, and then throw a big sweeping cut right across the front of his head. Nothing really to write home about on that end there, but I thought it was a really cool hand snipe that maybe people could utilize in their own fencing, even though, again, in this particular instance, it wasn't called. So for this next exchange, we have a little bit of a change of pace. Henry comes forward with his more classic, more well-experienced by me, big aggressive steps directly into range and comes at me with a big headshot. Now, knowing that Henry was capable of doing this and was pretty good at it, I had a pre-programmed response for when I saw this. And that pre-programmed response was just a shield house straight to the head. And the reason for this was two things. One, in this tournament, you got points even if you doubled, which meant that if I managed to hit Henry in the head with my just shield house straight to the head, well, I was going to get 2 points no matter what, even if he hit me back. And when you're up on points, doubling out in this way was a pretty beneficial thing to do. At the exact same time, I also knew that option 2 was that Henry often uses this big ballistic attack with a big lunge to actually disguise it as a low priority attack. Basically, he just uses that big footwork to get you into a defensive mindset, and the second he realizes you're going to try to parry, he goes somewhere where you can't really parry, like your hip bone or your leg, or maybe the inside of your forearm, and gets a point that way. So by throwing this ballistic shield how, I'm basically just hedging my bets. I'm making sure that no matter what option really happens here, I'm probably going to wind up on top, and I'm trying to punish Henry for any kind of aggression that he has so that he goes back to the defensive fencing that I'm much more used to and much more capable of handling. And in my opinion, this particular shield how that I throw isn't very good. If you can kind of tell by my crossguard, it's not exactly edged down, it's a little flat, and I kind of just slap Henry on the side of the head. But what happens after that is equally interesting. So my flat shield house slap to the head doesn't really count for much, but it does manage to get us into that right hand to left hand clash that I talked about earlier. And that clash does a pretty good job of stuffing the response that Henry obviously had pre-programmed in his head for if his entry attack didn't make it. And his pre-programmed response was to throw a left Zverkow. So off of this hand clash, I essentially stick my hand to Henry's hand, throw a right Zverkow that, again, frankly, probably can't do a whole lot of damage given that it doesn't have a great amount of rotation. But what's important for this is that it puts me in that right hanger parry, and it lets me defend myself from everything that Henry is trying to do. The idea here is that if you stick your hand to your opponent's hand and you just kind of dangle the sword in front of where they have to come from, they're not going to be able to hit anything. And while my Zverkow probably shouldn't count and my Shieldhow probably shouldn't count, the reality here is that we have a sequence where I was never in a situation where I could have been meaningfully hit unless Henry had decided to fully pull off and just completely leave the engagement. And that's a very interesting situation to be in. Remember, if you're the first person to realize that you're in a grapple situation, oftentimes you will be the winner. And in this particular situation, if either one of us had realized that we could just grapple our way out of this, chances are the person who did that was going to be the one who got the point, and not me, who got credit for a bad Shieldhow and a bad right Zverkow. Now, this next exchange is messy, and another one that normally I would kind of throw out. But the one reason I want to talk about this exchange is because of my final action. So in this exchange, Henry comes forward, taps my blade, goes for a hand strike. I do my usual thing of pulling my hands way back and then going for a counter shot. And my counter shot is meant to be a rising left Zverkow that was supposed to kind of like cleave his arms a little bit if he left him out there, or maybe hit him in the head. But Henry responds by going down almost onto one knee and getting so low that my left Zverkow just whiffs into the air. Great. Now, from this particular position, neither of us have really hit each other yet, but we're both in a situation where our swords aren't touching and we have no idea what the hell is going on, and so we're both just going to try to hit the other person. And my response to this is to just dip my point and go for that left ox thrust. And the reason I want to talk about this last action in particular is because it is very different from the meta-defining strike that I talked about in my last video, the left side shield howl kind of plunging cut thrusty thing. Some people call it a Sturzhau in the comments. Great, whatever. And the reason that this is different from that is a lot of very important key reasons. One is that I didn't get a good parry. So throwing this particular technique doesn't actually give me any of the advantages that I talked about in the last video. I don't have a dominant line. I don't have the inside line. I don't have any line. I just have the ability to kind of hit somebody. And more importantly, too, I throw it flat. Or at least if it was a cut, I threw it flat. I simply dip my point and go straight for the thrust. And the reason this is important is because the only reason I'm really able to get this is because A, I'm not moving forward when I throw this technique. B, Henry's not moving forward when he throws his technique. And C, my sword is about 4 inches shorter than most people's swords. And the reality here is that if I had chosen to do the technique that I talked about in the last video, the Sturzhau, the descending left shield howl that also sometimes is a thrust maybe, that particular technique would have worked out a hell of a lot better for me than the one that I actually chose to do. And the only reason I managed to pull this one off is because of the uniqueness of this situation. So if you need any more evidence as to why that previous technique is so effective, it's because there was a lot of ways that this would have gone very, very badly for me. And if I had used that technique, there are a lot of ways that I could have maybe bailed myself out of it. Either way, though, at the end of this, I get a little thrust to the arm, shoulder maybe, and then Henry just kind of cuts me in the body / the arm. And I think at the end of this, we just both come away with 1 point. So I skipped another exchange and went straight to the final exchange. And as a little bit of context for this final exchange, we are tied here, or at the very least, we're close to tied. Either way, both of us could win off of this final exchange, and it's very, very tense. And the reason that it's tense is because I tried to cheeky my little way out of this exchange by throwing a one-handed cut that ended up getting thrown out and giving 2 clean points to my opponent. So I let Henry catch up with that little mistake. But with this exchange, we see that play out in the form of a little bit of defensive measure games. So early on, I talked about the fact that Henry had changed dramatically his style, at least in his approach to fighting me, either that or the tournament, and as a result, he was fighting a little bit more defensive. But as we saw throughout the fight, he started getting more and more aggressive, and sometimes it worked out for him, and sometimes it didn't. But in this particular exchange, the defensive nature was one that I was able to capitalize on fairly effectively. Now, throughout this entire fight, the kind of bread and butter thing that I've been getting my points on was a Krumpau, setting off a stab from Henry, and then right Zwerking, taking advantage of the fact that when we clash with our right hand and his left hand, we would end up in some kind of situation that maybe, if I'm smart enough, I'd actually recognize as advantageous. So in this particular exchange, we have a little bit of a different interaction. I am using my footwork to try to back Henry up, and Henry is clearly looking for a parry riposte of his own. He's constantly moving backwards. He's throwing taps to my sword and maybe non-committed probing strikes to my hand just to make sure that I can't just bull rush him. But at the same time, I managed to back him up all the way to the corner and force him to kind of make any kind of aggressive motion. Now, despite this, he doesn't throw a really big stepping cut. He just throws a little bit of a get away from me thrust. And at this point, I parry that out of the way, I start to move forward, and I recognize that this is actually a baited setup by Henry. Henry was throwing out probing strikes because he knew that I love me some parry riposte, and that if he could get me to parry something that wasn't committed and then throw a riposte while Henry was moving backwards, he could effectively bait me into being the aggressor and get a parry riposte of his own. So I parry Henry's blade off to the side, I start to come forward, and I recognize that this is a trap, and so instead of just throwing my riposte right out of the gate, I continue to move forward, but then I look at what Henry is doing, and what I see is another thrust. So I parry it once again, and I manage to get that right Zwerkow this time to the hands, but I also utilize a technique known as overrunning to make sure that I stay safe. Now, one of the things about the right Zwerkow is that it can often end in a situation where you expose the back of the head. The reason for this is that when you're right-handed and you turn your hips into a Zwerkow, you end up in a spot where rotating your hips and then maybe over rotating them exposes the back of your head to what is now the person standing in front of you. And if you combine that with an idea where you throw your right zverkow, you land your technique, and then you start running in the direction that you're currently facing, you are going to run past your opponent at an angle that absolutely exposes the back of your head. So what you have to make sure to do is do the old back parry. Now, some people will card you for this. Some people will tell you you're being dangerous. In my opinion, this is an application of a historical technique and one that works actually really, really well, in particularly because it's actually pretty easy to defend your back of the head with your sword as long as you're doing this technique appropriately. So you land your right spheric, you start to run past your opponent, and you just kind of hold it here on the back. And the reason for this is that as you're going past your opponent, the only option they really have is to throw a cut from their left to their right towards your back, and having a giant steel bar that extends the length of your back means that unless they're trying to thrust you, which is basically impossible, they're not going to be able to land anything except maybe the nick of the front of your arm. If they go for the back of your head, it's just going to hit sword. If they go for your spine, it's just going to hit sword. The only thing they can really hit without interfering with the sword is this front meaty part of your shoulder, which no one thinks is a bad target to get hit in terms of damage. So you're pretty protected. Anyway, that's what pulls off here. I run straight out of the ring. I slam into the stage of the high school, and I managed to get the win off on this one. Now, again, one of the key features of this is that I was taking advantage of a baited trap that Henry had set for me, and one that, if you learn how to do, will absolutely catch 90% of people. I was in a way very lucky here that despite the fact that I had gotten the parry that I was so badly looking for, I didn't just immediately throw a response. And you can see here by looking at the footage, if I had simply thrown my right zverkow directly out of the gate as I got that first parry, I would have absolutely whiffed into the air and Henry would have probably stabbed me directly in the gut. So really well played from Henry, really well played from me, I guess. And despite the fact that I maybe got some points that I didn't deserve, and Henry may have gotten some points that he didn't maybe deserve too, at the end of the day, it all comes out in the wash, and we have a really, really great fun fight that, again, was from third place. So if you'd like to see more stuff like this, feel free to subscribe. I'll be coming out with more videos next week.